It was my first day working in the morgue. The night shift seemed promising, calm at first glance, as if it were just another common routine. The cold air of the early morning filled the room, and the only sound that could be heard was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, which flickered occasionally, creating a strange atmosphere. The silence was so intense that it seemed to consume all the space around. The solitude of that place was oppressive, and an inexplicable sense of discomfort slowly crept into my body. My job seemed simple: organize documents, register entries and exits, and ensure everything was in order. Nothing I can't handle, I thought, trying to push away the discomfort that was starting to grow within me. But as time passed, I realized that the calm was just a facade, hiding something much more sinister, something I could never forget. As I reviewed the papers, a faint and almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. It was a scraping sound, as if something was being slowly scraped against metal. The noise seemed to come from a distant point in the main corridor. I stood up slowly, feeling a wave of cold run down my spine. I looked around, but everything seemed to be silent again. It must be the wind, I told myself, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. Still, a strange sensation that I was being watched overtook me. I grabbed the flashlight, a small gesture that, although simple, felt like a way to protect myself, and began to walk cautiously down the corridor. The air felt thicker as I got closer to the autopsy room, and my mind was becoming more and more alert. When I finally reached the door, my heart nearly stopped. The body drawer, normally closed and secure, was open. One of the drawers, the one that should have been sealed, was slightly open, revealing the dark emptiness inside. I was sure all of them were properly closed before my shift started. A sense of panic took over me as my mind tried to process what was happening. What could have caused this? Was there a mistake, a misunderstanding, or something else? Something beyond my comprehension? My body stood still for a moment, my gaze fixed on the open drawer, unable to do anything. The silence of the room now seemed deafening, and I knew something was happening there, something no one should ever discover. My mind was desperately trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Perhaps a previous employee had forgotten to close the drawer properly, or maybe the locking mechanism had failed in some way. But, as I approached the open drawer, something much stranger began to happen. The air around me became unnaturally cold, as if I had stepped into a frozen chamber. A cold breeze seemed to emanate from the drawer, cutting through the thick silence of the room. In addition, there was a smell. It wasn't the typical odor of a morgue, but something denser, more acrid, that seemed to invade my nostrils with an unusual intensity. It was a smell that shouldn't have been there. Something wrong, something I couldn't comprehend. Even with my mind filled with rational explanations, I knew that something was far from normal. With an impulse to regain control, I decided to push the drawer back into place, trying to restore order. When I placed my hand on the handle, a soft sound, almost like a sigh, swept through the room. It was so faint that, for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. However, the sound sent a chill through me from head to toe, and without thinking, I quickly pulled away from the drawer. My heart was racing as the lights above began to flicker, as if the entire room were reacting to something invisible, something terrible. The flickering of the lights made everything even more confusing and terrifying. It was at that moment, when they blinked, that I noticed a shadow in the corner of the room. The silhouette was tall, almost touching the ceiling, but the most unsettling thing was the way it twisted, moving in a completely unnatural way. It was as if the shadow had a life of its own, distorting in a way that no human being could possibly do. I tried to close my eyes for a moment, forcing my mind to accept that it might be a hallucination, something caused by tension or fear. It must be in my head, I kept telling myself. But when I opened my eyes again, the shadow was no longer there. In its place, only the emptiness of a seemingly lifeless room, but a cold feeling still lingered. However, the silence didn't last long. The scratching started again, this time coming from somewhere behind me. The sound was sharp, the noise of sharp claws scraping slowly against metal, and it was much closer than before. I quickly turned around, trying to find the source of the sound, but when I looked around, there was nothing. Only the closed drawers, the heavy air, and the sound of my own panic echoing through the cold walls of the morgue. The fear was beginning to consume my entire being. Every breath felt harder to control, and panic was spreading faster than I could process. I looked again at the drawer, now completely closed, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong never faded. The sound continued, echoing around me, but there was no plausible explanation, nothing that I could rationalize. Every detail of the environment seemed to be conspiring against my sanity. Every shadow, every sound, every movement of the lights. I no longer knew what to think, only that something was about to happen. Something that, contrary to all my logical beliefs, was very real, and I was about to be forced to face the truth of what was hiding there. I decided that I couldn't stand there any longer, waiting for whatever was happening. Fear was starting to take over me relentlessly, and my mind was in complete chaos. I ran back to the main room, but when I reached the door, something was wrong. The door I had carefully locked at the start of my shift was now slightly ajar, as if it had been forced open, or as if it had been invaded by a presence that shouldn't have been there. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step, and the environment seemed to close in around me. With my breath quickening and my mind growing more and more foggy, I stepped out into the corridor, but instead of relief, what I found was even more unsettling. The lights were now flickering more intensely, as if they were fighting against the darkness that seemed to want to swallow the place. The sounds, once isolated, now became more distinct. Footsteps, scratching, movements. Everything echoed back and forth, but I was alone. At least that's what I believed. The feeling of being watched had never been so strong, and suddenly, a voice called my name. It wasn't a scream or a loud sound, but a low, soft whisper, as if it came from all directions at once. My body froze instantly, and the only thing I could do was close my eyes and pray, hoping it was just a passing nightmare. But the feeling that something was about to happen paralyzed me. That whisper seemed to drag itself down the hallway, curling around me, trying to reach me in some way. There was no escape. The door, the corridor, the morgue. Everything seemed to be impregnated with a presence that shouldn't exist. And even with panic taking over, I knew there was nothing left to do. I was trapped in some sort of psychological and physical labyrinth, where reality and fear blurred together. The pressure on my chest only grew, and the only thing I could do was run. Run aimlessly, without direction, without hope of finding an exit. When I finally managed to leave the building, the relief was momentary. But what had happened that night was etched in my mind in a way I could never understand. However, what was even more disturbing was that, deep down, I knew that what I had felt, what I had experienced, wasn't a product of my imagination. It was real, in some way. And even when I physically distanced myself from the place, the feeling that something remained there, waiting, never left me. Every time I pass that building, a wave of chills runs through me, as if something is watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to act. The truth is, after that night, I quit the job without a second thought. I didn't seek answers, didn't ask others what could have happened. I never spoke to anyone about it until now. Maybe it was my mind, maybe something I simply can't explain. But regardless of what it was, fear never left me. Every night I spend alone, especially when the darkness takes over, I can still hear that whisper, calling my name as if it's lurking, waiting for the moment when I'll return to the place where it all began. I was never superstitious. From the very beginning of my career in the morgue, I always treated the job like any other, simple, quiet, and calm. Just me and the bodies. Only the sound of breathing and the empty environment. However, working there at night, far from any company, began to make me question everything I thought about fears and beliefs. During the day, the place was a regular structure, but when night fell, the silence became denser, and the shadows seemed to move around me. I always believed that the fear people had of these places was a product of their minds, more psychological than real, until something happened that made me completely rethink my perception. It was an ordinary night, and the usual silence filled the morgue. But suddenly, the sound of something falling in the main hallway broke the stillness. My first thought was that some object had been misplaced or that a shelf had collapsed. I grabbed the flashlight and went to check. However, as I walked through the corridors, a strange feeling overtook me. The silence, which had once been comforting, now became oppressive. Every step I took echoed, creating the feeling that something or someone was watching me. This made me uncomfortable, but thinking it was just my mind playing tricks, I pressed on. When I reached the source of the noise, I found a clipboard on the floor. The curious thing was that it was in a spot in the hallway where I was sure no one had been before. I picked up the clipboard, but a strange sensation ran through me, as if something was about to happen. A cold breeze passed by me, but there were no open windows, and the morgue's ventilation was practically non-existent. Ignoring the feeling, I returned to the main room, but then the sound changed. It was a tapping, subtle but firm, coming from one of the drawers where the bodies are stored, as if someone was trying to get out from inside it. My heart raced. The tension was palpable. I knew I should call for help, but something inside me told me not to, as if, somehow, it was expected that I go there alone. When I finally reached the main room, the sound abruptly ceased, as if the place had somehow absorbed all the noise around it. The air was denser, and a heavy sensation seemed to hang in the environment. A metallic, stifling fragrance invaded my nostrils, as if the room was saturated with something strange and unusual. It was then that my gaze fixed on a detail that shouldn't have been there. One of the drawers, usually well closed and locked, was slightly open. A wave of panic overtook me, as I was certain that all the drawers had been properly shut. My stomach churned in a way I had never felt before, a mixture of fear and disgust. Even with trembling hands, I pulled out the drawer, and what I found there made me tremble. The body was intact, but something was completely wrong. The eyes, which should have been closed in eternal rest, were now fixed on me, open and with an intense stare, almost as if it were looking back at me. A sense of terror engulfed my body, and fear took form, becoming something tangible. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. Trying to back away, I stumbled and fell to the floor. The sound of heavy footsteps began to echo through the room, but when I looked around, I saw no one. The noise seemed to come from all sides, as if an invisible presence were walking between the shadows of the morgue. I rushed to my feet, my heart racing, trying to rationalize everything. I needed an explanation. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the tension was affecting me more than I realized. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my nerves, but when I turned to leave the room, something even more terrifying happened. The door, which I was sure had been open, was now closed, locked. There was no reason for this, and the feeling of being trapped began to engulf me. Panic set in, and I began to hear something even more disturbing. Whispers, low and indistinct, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. The words didn't make sense, but one repeated insistently, "Stay." That word echoed in my mind, whispered like an imperative command, and I couldn't ignore it. Something inside me made me look back once again, even though I knew I shouldn't. When I did, the scene I found froze me completely. The body that had been in the drawer was now gone. The drawer was empty. The emptiness of its absence was even more terrifying than its presence. A chill ran down my spine, and a wave of panic took over me like never before. There was nothing more I could do. The door was locked, and there was no way out. Something was watching me, and whatever it was, it seemed to want me to stay. The lights began to flicker intermittently, as if the very environment was being consumed by an invisible energy. It was as though the place was trying to warn something, or someone, that something was about to happen. It was then that a figure appeared in the corner of the room, slowly, as if materializing directly from the darkness. The shadow was tall, indistinct, but with movements that didn't seem human, as if it were made of pure darkness and something else. My muscles froze instantly, and I stood there, motionless, watching that presence approaching with a chilling calmness. The air around me felt dense and oppressive, and the whispers that were once just low murmurs now transformed into sharp, desperate screams, as if thousands of voices were crying for help or for revenge. Fear overtook me in an unbearable way, and with a desperate impulse, I shut my eyes, trying to block the sight of that figure. I prayed as I never had before, hoping it was just a nightmare or a hallucination, something my mind had invented to justify the growing terror. When I finally opened my eyes, everything seemed to have returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. The room was calm, the lights stable again, and the body was back in the drawer, exactly as it should have been. The door was open, as if nothing had occurred, and silence returned to the space. But in my mind, the feeling of terror had not dissipated. The vision of that figure was still fresh. The presence of that shadow seemed to have left a mark on my soul, something that would not easily fade. Without thinking twice, I ran out of the morgue, not looking back, as if doing so would prevent it from following me. The next morning I quit. The words left my mouth like an order, and my decision was firm. I would never return to that place again. Though I left the morgue behind, something inside me knew the experience was not over. Sometimes on the quietest nights, when I'm home alone, I still hear the whispers. They're low, almost imperceptible at first, but the message is clear, repetitive, and inescapable. Stay. Even now, years later, that word still echoes in my mind, like a reminder of what happened in that place. I know that something there marked me in a way I will never forget, and deep down, I fear that the shadow I saw, or whatever it was, has never truly left me.